Hello, this is Virtualis the Chess Noob, learning and having fun with chess. Do you like winning at chess and having fun while doing so? Then you should play the Vienna Gambit, the Mozart of chess openings. Brilliant, yet whimsical. This is a complete guide to learning how to play the Vienna Gambit with a target audience of beginner intermediate players who may have been playing a different opening. Maybe you've been playing the Italian or the Scotch. I'm going to cover the introduction, the Vienna Gambit accepted, and also the most common ways the Vienna Gambit is declined. Have a look at the video description for the subsections for the particular parts of the video. There'll also be some further viewing of other videos. Let's begin. Alright, so what is the Vienna Gambit? It's an opening for white, and you have to start with e4, and black must respond with e5. So anything else, the Vienna game and the Vienna Gambit is not possible. Next, we play the Queen's Knight, Knight c3, ostensibly seemingly a little bit passive, and this begins the Vienna game. Now here, the most common responses by black is either the one of the two knights. If black plays the King's Knight, that's the folk beer variation, and we now have f4, the beginning of the Vienna Gambit. Now, sometimes black will respond with the other knight, and this is known as a Max Lang defense. In a Max Lang defense, you can actually play f4, and it actually is known as the Vienna Gambit as well. This is the Max Lang Vienna Gambit. It's not quite as good. I'm not going to cover it in this video because usually when we talk about the Vienna Gambit, we're talking about the Folkby variation. Now, I will say that in this system, sometimes you can end up transposing into the usual Vienna Gambit. Now, back here, the best response for black is d5, and if they did that, we would now enter the Vienna game main line. In this video, I'm not going to cover the main line. Have a look at the descriptions for videos on how to play the main line. Usually when we talk about the Vienna Gambit, it's on the assumption that the opponent doesn't enter the main line. Let's now look at what to do when we get a Vienna Gambit accepted. So in the Vienna Gambit, we would want our opponent with the black pieces to accept, because it's always super exciting when that happens. So Vienna Gambit accepted is when they take the pawn. Part of the logic here is that we are moving their central pawn off to the side. And so whenever they accept, our next move is to immediately strike forward with the e-pawn to e5. And here black is in some immediate trouble because that black knight has nowhere good to go on the board. And in fact, it almost looks like that the only move that they have is returning the knight to its opening square of g8. And the surprising thing here is that this is in fact the best move for black. So let's see what we might do when they play that move. So black undeveloping the knight is in fact the best move. Here we need to always keep an eye in the Vienna games, in Vienna Gambit games, that the queen could come to h4, which is with check, and that is potentially problematic. So the next move here is to develop the other knight. Firstly, we develop the knight, so that's great, but it also covers the h4 square, which pretty much takes away that tactic from black. Now, what's the next strategic approach here? Generally, the idea is we've got a lot more development now than black because they used the move to bring the knight out and used the move to move the knight back. So what we want to do is to strategically take advantage of our more rapid development. So to control the center with pawns, develop pieces, castle, launch an attack. So what that might that look like? So they may develop their other knight. Here we push a pawn into the center, take control of the center. That now opens that diagonal for us to recapture potentially that pawn. We might want to develop the bishop, placing pressure on the f-file, because after we short castle, potentially one of the thematic ideas of the Vienna Gambit and the Vienna game generally is to put pressure down the f-file. So that's what it might look like. So let's say we move the game forward, they may develop that bishop. We now take that pawn. They might not want us to move into that square, so push an h pawn. Here we deal with the other bishop. They might try to put some pressure into the center. Short castles, they take, we take back. Maybe they, with the lack of development, they try to launch an attack on our piece. And now we've got sacrifice capture of that f pawn. King captures, this idea of attacking down the f-file. And now we move our knight to the edge of the board. They think they've hung the knight, but in fact, we now have an attack on the queen with a discovered check, and we are completely winning. So that would be a very, very nice Vienna Gambit accepted game. Now, let's move back to this position after they accept, and we are now attacking that knight. Obviously, undeveloping the knight feels wrong. So not uncommonly, black will try to find a way to not undevelop the knight. And almost all players will discover, hold on, I can bring my queen here to, to pin the pawn to the king. So that's a pretty common move that black will make in Vienna Gambit lines. Now, the good thing for white is that this is bad for black because we can undevelop simply by a symmetrical queen to e2 move, and the pawn is once again attacking the knight. Now the knight really must retreat. There's nothing for it to do. And in this position, we have one of two options. Knight to f3 is a sensible move, and the game will end up looking quite similar to the game we just saw. The spicy, rather risky and unequal game is to actually allow queen to h4 with check and play d4 immediately. So let's say we play that normal move, so we block, and then they develop, and here very similar ideas. We try to take back that pawn, control the center, develop pieces, make use of our more rapid development, castle, and additional tactic with the queen on e7, knight to d5 becomes a potentially very powerful move with an attack on the queen, also a fork on the c7 square, which of course comes with an absolute fork of the king and rook. So that's what that might look at. That's what it might look like. What if we played the pawn to d5? Well, queen will now come with check. Now, if you look at Stockfish, the best move here is to move the king to d1. However, I would suggest that you wouldn't play down this line if you weren't going for a particular trap where we could end up trapping the black queen in the corner of the board. So here, I would sort of recommend, if you're going to go down this line at all, is to play g3. And here, of course, they will capture. There's going to be a discovered check with a move of the pawn. So it looks like it's really good for black, and it actually is pretty good. So, black is ahead. Now we have knight to f3, which attacks the queen. Very commonly, they're going to move the pawn forward. That now comes with check. We get rid of the queen with our knight, but of course, they now capture our rook with promotion to a new queen. But here, we bring our knight back and slam shut the door to our castle. That queen has nowhere to go. And the next few moves here for us is to set up a system so that we can capture the queen. Now, black is actually fine here, but they have to find the best move, which is not particularly obvious. If they don't find this move, white is actually completely fine. They need to find b6, not the most obvious move. Let's say they don't find that move. Now our goal is to develop. They may now try to develop themselves. We long castle, they play another move, and now bishop to g2, attacking the queen. Everything is defended. The queen now has no option other than to sacrifice herself for the other rook. We take back, and now we enter a very, very unbalanced game. Black is in fact up 2 points of material, but we've got a queen, but we've lost both our rooks, and in this position, white is slightly ahead. A very spicy and interesting game of the Vienna Gambit accepted. Let's now move to the Vienna Gambit declined. Okay, so the Vienna Gambit declined is when black opts to not capture our f-pawn with their e-pawn. Now, if they choose to not do this, well, black is facing some problems because our f-pawn is attacking the e-pawn, and the e-pawn is otherwise not defended. And black doesn't really have that many options here. So the most common options would be to defend with the knight, defend with the bishop, or defend with the pawn. I'm going to focus now on the knight first, but before I do that, not very often, but occasionally, black will for some reason play some other move and not defend that e-pawn. In that situation, we should straight up capture. It's a mistake for them to not defend the e-pawn, more so than any other move. Usually they will defend, and one of the most common ways they'll defend, as I mentioned before, is knight to c6. So this is a knight c6 decline of the Vienna Gambit. The good thing for us is that this is not good for black. And the way you would play that is to immediately capture that pawn, and we are, of course, putting pressure on the knight on f6. If you remember from the Vienna Gambit accepted part of the video, the knight has nowhere good to go. So black must do something about that threat. And pretty much unless they want to immediately retreat, the logical thing is to capture. And so they will generally capture, but now we have d4, developing another pawn, taking control of the center, attacking the knight again. And here, this knight has only one of two places it can go, either here or here. Let's say they go to g6. We now have another pawn move, e5, and this knight once again faces all the same problems as the Vienna Gambit accepted. It has nowhere good to go. It looks like it has to undevelop back to g8. In fact, that is the best move in this position. And from here on, we play in a very similar way to the Vienna Gambit accepted. So we need to watch out for queen to h4 with check, so develop the other knight. And from here on in, white is doing very well. We make use of our much more rapid development. We try to develop pieces. We've got the center, short castles, and then attack down this f-file. Now, what if here the black player decides to do that queen pin? So queen to e7 pin, again, very similar to the Vienna Gambit accepted. We unpin with a symmetrical queen move. The pawn is once again attacking the knight. The knight has to go back. We develop our knight, try to develop pieces, short castles, and remember with the queen on e7, we have this very powerful knight to d5 move with the fork of the queen and c7 square. So we've got that tactic when the queen is out. Now, what if the knight jumped to c6 rather than g6? Well, relatively similar. So we still push. If the knight goes away, it's basically the same, okay? However, there is a difference here now. If they play queen e7 to pin, we cannot play that symmetrical move because we need the queen to be defending the d4 pawn. And also, if they capture that pawn, they also place pressure on our queen as well. So when the knight jumps back to c6, you have to remember that the correct move is to break the pin with the bishop. So bishop to e2, and now it's fairly similar. So knight has to go back. We develop that knight, and we've now got similar ideas. Remember, the knight to d5 is a very powerful tactic. We try to develop pieces, and we aim to short castle attack down the f-file. All right, now occasionally Black will try to decline the gambit with bishop to d6. Again, a piece to defend the e5 pawn. And the thing to remember here is that the tactic is very, very similar to if Black declined a gambit with knight c6, which is, if you remember, immediately capture, now places pressure on, the knight and the bishop. Bishop, of course, came here to defend that pawn, so they're going to capture. Now d4, attacking the bishop. Bishop pretty much has nowhere good to go. If you look, every position is defended, and so it must go back. There we are, and of course, just like last time, we now push e5 with the fork of the bishop and the knight. One of these pieces are lost, so generally what they will do is to bring the bishop back and we take the knight. We win a piece. Brilliant. Happy days. Alternatively, they may try to do something like pin with the queen. It basically doesn't work because we can unpin with the queen. There is still a fork. One of these pieces will be lost. And lastly, Black can decline the Vienna Gambit with d6. And this is, in fact, I would say the least bad way of declining the Vienna Gambit. So against the Vienna Gambit, really, Black only has one good move, which is to play the Vienna game main line, which is d5. As I said, we're not going to cover the main line in this video, but you can look at the description for some more information on how to play the main line. d6 is an okay defense. White is definitely ahead, but there are no sort of killer moves for White here. White has to play the position carefully, otherwise Black can potentially get back ahead. In fact, I've lost plenty of Vienna Gambit games against Black where they've played d6 to defend. So this is where knowing some of the logical ideas is actually very helpful. Now here, when the opponent plays d6, a fairly sort of slow, conservative, but solid defense, what we potentially want to do is to immediately take space and crack into the center by putting 3 pawns into the center. So we want to play d4 if possible, because once we have d4, we then have potentially 2 attackers on that pawn, and that's potentially very powerful. However, to prepare for the 3rd pawn in the center, we first need to develop our knight. And now we've got the queen and the knight defending that square, and it's happy days. So this is the single best move to play, and you have to play this move. Now, depending on how Black responds, d4 is often possible. So the single most common way that Black will respond in this position is to develop their knight. Very natural looking, developing all the knights. And here we should now play d4, and they pretty much have to take. Because if they don't take, we can take with either of these pieces, and the pressure here is problematic for Black. So we would expect them to take, we capture back with knight, and then depending on what happens, us capturing that knight or capturing back and then taking back with queen is fine for White. It's roughly about plus 0.5. You have to then sort of play a game of chess, but we get an advantage in the opening. So that's one way. Now, sometimes black will develop their dark square bishop. That's a perfectly reasonable developing move. And again here, because they're staying somewhat more conservatively, we can now play d4, and it's a similar idea. That pretty much they have to take, and here we can take back with either the knight or the queen. Either of those moves are fine. Taking back with the queen is a little bit more risky because your queen's in the center of the board, though Stockfish thinks that it's actually slightly better. Taking back with the knight is perfectly good too. Now, the third sort of a common move that we will see after knight to f3 is that black will start to get a little bit skittish. You know, they start to not play within the theme of a conservative, just focus on defense, and they will play bishop to g4 with a goal to pin the knight to the queen. And this is actually a mistake for black. And for white, we've actually got a number of potentially good moves. Now here, we cannot play d4 because the knight is pinned to the queen. So what we can do, however, is we can play d3. That's perfectly okay, keeping the tension. Or we can break the pin with bishop to e2. However, probably the most direct way of playing this, and probably what I would recommend, is to play h6. Pretty much immediately asking the question, why has black played the bishop to that square? Basically here, black has to commit. Their best move is to capture the knight, and we capture back, and it's fine for us because we still have the bishop pair. They've lost their bishop pair. We've got some development. It's perfectly good for white. If they choose not to take the knight, one of the best moves actually for black is to underdevelop the knight. They can sort of play the, underdevelop the bishop, sorry. They can play the bishop also to, I think, the e6 square, but it's basically saying this was not the right place for the bishop. However, commonly what will happen is a line where you may well end up trapping black's bishop because they'll want to maintain the pin, and so they'll play bishop to h4, maintaining the pin, but now we've got a g4 attacking the bishop again. There's nowhere it can move. So bishop to g6, and now bang, f5, bishop is trapped. We're going to win their bishop, and we basically then play a good game of chess out of the opening where we're up a piece of material. Good game. The Vienna Gambit is one of the most fun openings in chess. It's absolutely my favorite. Really should give it a go. Quite effective at the beginner intermediate level. The main thing I didn't cover in this video is the Vienna game main line, which comes out of the Vienna Gambit and in fact is the only good response by black, playing d5. Black is slightly ahead and has some very good attacking chances in the main line. As a player with white, it's something to learn. At the beginner intermediate level, most people won't actually play the main line. But as you develop and get a little bit better, people will play the main line, and you need to know the way to defend against that position. I hope you enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.